Joe Lycett is a fascinating individual, and I got to have a conversation with him. Welcome back to the series where I go through all the podcasts I've ever done with a famous comedian. Today we have Joe Lycett. Joe Lycett is a fascinating guy because he's one of these people who's more political than he seems and much more creative and bright and energetic than I thought he would be after now that I've met him in person. And what I loved about this conversation is it actually happened during COVID, like right at the end of the big 6-month lockdown in 2021. So a lot of us hadn't done comedy in so long. So this conversation was really fueled by that energy and brightness of being able to finally get on stage and do comedy for the first time in so long. If you're new here, this is the series where I break down all the podcasts I've ever had with famous comedians, so you guys don't have to watch the whole episode. Joe Lycett is a really cool guy, and he's also not a guy without his own controversy. So if you like the fact that he changed his name to Hugo Boss to make a political point, give this video a like. If you don't like the fact that he changed his name to Hugo Boss to make a political point, then leave a comment. But either way, make sure you subscribe. I'm going to be taking you through different segments of our conversation and showing you Joe's opinions on things that you've never ever heard of. And stick to the end because I always leave the best clips until the last. So here's Joe talking about getting back into comedy after COVID.
And what about you, Joe? When was the last one you did before the weekend?
August. I thought it was July, but I worked it out. In fact, I'm going to have a look at my diary and remind myself exactly. But it was August last year. It was at the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre. And it was on the 24th of August. And I did 2 back-to-back. I hosted, and it was all very last minute. I wasn't planning on doing any stand-up at that time. But Jimmy Carr was meant to play there that night, and he had to pull out because he hadn't worked out. Oh, it was something to do with a quarantine thing. He'd gone to Dubai and then hadn't quite realised that when he got back from Dubai, he'd have to quarantine. So he couldn't do that show. So I swooped in and did a kind of Joe and Friends with Aisling B did one, Nathan Caton. There was loads of good eggs on. And the first one, because that's the longest I'd gone at that point without doing stand-up, it's probably, would have been February time. So getting on for 6 months, and I've never done a 6-month stint without doing stand-up since I started. And that first show, God, I was so ropey. I properly didn't know what I was doing. I was like, how does this work? I was like stumbling over myself all over the place. But then because we just finished that show and went straight into another one, the second one I was like, I'm back and I can do it, and I feel like I felt really good about it. So that was really fun. And
just to bring some of you into what this was like, I know a lot of you are fans of comedy, so I want to give you an insight into the world of being a comedian during COVID. We literally live and die by being on stage and being in front of people and getting energy from other people. So the fact that we all had to be locked down and we couldn't do stand-up made people do really desperate stuff, like doing Zoom gigs. Like Zoom gigs would have never existed in any other time if it weren't for loads of extroverted comedians being locked down in their own house. So this was a really fascinating time for us because I feel it gave everyone a time to reflect and slow down and figure out what they really loved about comedy. So when everything opened up again, I think there was this real fervor and craze in the air because everyone just wanted to get on stage and try new stuff, and they realized their old stuff didn't work anymore, and it was like the whole world was just opened up. And this is when I started comedy, so was kind of my introduction to the world, and it was such a cool time to start because it was just this explosion in creativity all at once. And here's a clip of how Joe talks about writing on stage in basically a post-COVID world.
So are you trying to do new stuff? Because that's the other thing. Last night, Ricky did pretty much brand new stuff.
Yeah.
Is that what you are trying to do? Like, were you, even though you were comparing the Glee, were you able to try and do new stuff, or did you just mess around?
No, I was trying to do new stuff, and I was buoyed by the fact that I kind of wrote stuff on stage that will almost inevitably go into the tour. And so that's really exciting when you're like playing out an idea and seeing where it goes, and the audience chip in with like, because I often will sort of say like, so what I was talking about on Friday was trying to be more masculine and trying to be masculine in real life. And we'd just been talking about a chip shop. So I was like, oh, if I go into a chip shop, and then I started like talking about the stuff you can order in a chip shop, and people were shouting things out. And then I was sort of building, like, what's the most masculine thing you can order in a chip shop? And people were like,
Saveloy.
So, no, that's it. I think Saveloy is pretty gay, actually. So, like, the chip, like, I was doing the pie, and then I started like building on like how to be masculine with the pie, and it obviously ended with me like fucking the pie, and like, and I'm sure that will become a bit of a routine now. And it was just through that night, and that's what I love about live stand-up, and that is, in, at least for me, integral in terms of building a show, is I have to build it with others. And by others, I mean the room that I'm in front of. I'll go in with a bit of a story, but actually building that story is a collaborative effort. And I couldn't do that in the last 18 months without an audience. And so I was just so excited. And now I just want to do stand-up all the time.
What I love about this clip is, like, I think it really breaks down for a lot of people how comedians write, because there's a few camps of people. There's the people who think everything a comedian says is scripted. Then there's the people who think, oh, I could do that. He just gets on stage and starts talking. And kind of neither is really true, because you kind of have different camps of people. There are some people who can go on stage and basically start talking, but that's kind of built around structures that help to promote the chat, if that makes sense. So you'll probably notice whenever you go to a comedy club, a comedian will be like, what do you do for work? Blah, blah, blah. Is this your wife? When did you meet? There are certain questions you can ask that really build up a conversation. And I've actually found myself using these questions in everyday life as a sort of way to promote conversation. But I think what it really shows is that comedians aren't necessarily speaking off the cuff, but they're also not necessarily doing their own written material. Especially someone like Joe as well. Like, he's a very conversational comedian. Like, he's very much in the room. He's very much like in front of you. It's not just like a play, which maybe some comedians can kind of be. For him, it's very much, I am here with you and we're telling jokes together. Also, I think one thing I thought about Joe was I thought he was quite like a social commentary comedian. So here's him talking about when he was on I Got News for You and how he actually kind of felt uncomfortable in that environment, being on stage with a bunch of people who were seen as intellectuals. So here's how he made that situation work for him.
I had this a little bit when I did Have I Got News for You recently. I found it quite tricky to work out how to approach it, because I watched previous episodes and there's all these like brilliant stand-ups who do loads of political material and they talk about, you know, the news and they understand all of the references and whatever. And I'm not that. And part of me was thinking, oh, should I have said no to this actually? I shouldn't really do this show because it's not really me. And then I sort of arrived at the decision that actually the only way for me to do it is do it as me. So like, what would I actually like, how would I actually make this my world? So it wasn't about, it was to do with that week, it was to do with Johnson and Cummings falling out, and Cummings had written a blog or whatever. And I didn't really have anything fresh or new to say about Norris Bonsnell, and Dominic Cummings. I don't have anything that anyone else wasn't going to say before me. So the only thing that I could do is make it about my world. So I made it about two friends. I said, oh, I know where this is going because that reminds me of my friend Claire and Steph, and they fell out over this or whatever. And you take it into your space and make it about your world, I suppose. And so, yeah, there would have been a lot of hack material around that time about those things, but you can still talk about those things in a different way. What is it Quentin Crisp always used to say, that when you go on a talk show or a chat show, you go on to say the thing you wanted to say. You always go on with what the thing you're going to say. And it's like when you do an exam in geography when you're at school, and the night before you research loads about France, and then you open the exam and it says, tell us about Germany. And you go, well, Germany's not like France. It's exactly the same. You go into a gig or you go into a chat show or a panel show. with exactly the thing that you want to say, and you just find your way to it, basically. It's about the links between things, really. It's rather than actually having anything fresh to say.
With that whole political thing, I think it's interesting how he decides he can bring other people into his world, and how he doesn't have to conform to the idea of being a political comedian and being someone who will essentially just talk about the Labour Party and Rishi Sunak, or whoever it was, Boris Johnson back then. He realizes that to do comedy, you don't necessarily have to fit a mold, and you can kind of make it however you want it to be. And one thing that this conversation also taught me is Joe is a pansexual guy who's relatively camp. So because of that, he has a situation where anything he talks about will almost be overtly political. And me being a black person on stage as well, I was talking about this in the conversation and how I related to this as well, because basically any joke that I tell can kind of be seen through this lens of race, which for better or for worse is seen as a political issue. So it means that any joke that I tell has this like effect of being affected by politics. Like I say, actually, you know what? I'm going to stop talking. Listen to what we said.
Well, part of me, I don't think this is the case. It certainly isn't the case with black acts, but with camp, part of the whole identity of camp is sort of people find it funny in and of itself. Like when you're like being camp, it sort of reminds people of camp acts of old, I suppose. But also like it's sort of there is something silly about camp, and so sometimes like I'm trying not to be funny, and actually I end up being funnier because you don't take me seriously because I'm camp, essentially. So like there is something sometimes quite frustrating about that, you know, I in my head, like when I go for a jog, when in my head I think I'm like this sort of stallion running through Birmingham. And actually, I'm sure if I looked at myself across the street, sometimes you do catch yourself in the window of a whatever, and you're like, oh, I'm just a fucking puff. And I'm just around. No one's taking him seriously.
And the question that I always ask different comedians, it's the how do you write? I really wanted to know this, so I asked Joe on the podcast, so listen to his answer.
But I like what you said, Ricky, about, you know, you can't afford to choose with your jokes, because I've over 10 years of doing it, I feel exactly the same. The minute I'm getting laughs, I'm like, right, well, that's it. You know, I don't have an abundance of material by any means. I'm always scraping away to get new stuff. It takes me so long, and I find I'd love to find an easier way of writing stand-up, but I just never have. It's always takes me ages and always is awkward and difficult, and yeah.
Do we know anyone who's got an easier way of writing stand-up? Do any of our friends have an easier way? I can't think.
Rob Beckett always sort of talks about how, like, he just sort of he doesn't seem to have any kind of friction with his writing. He just sort of sits down and writes. And I know Jimmy Carr has this thing of what does he say? It's like I don't write because I need to write jokes. I write because it's 9 a.m. and that's the time for writing. You know, it's like he just gets up and he sits and he writes, and it's not about creating a volume of stuff. It's just like, just write. And I know a lot of designers and artists will talk about, you know, inspiration and how that's a bit of a it just doesn't really exist. You can't wait for inspiration. You do just have to start making things, and that is my experience.
What I love about Joe is he always seems to have like an enemy at the moment that he kind of is taking down with a comedy. Like I remember when Suella Braverman got sacked from the Home Office, and he tweeted like being unemployed is a lifestyle choice or something, and when he changed his name to Hugo Boss, and here's him talking about when he was really analyzing the idea of Peppa Pig, Heinz beans, saying they're one of your 5 a day.
It's funny you mentioned that. Well, I've got a thing with Peppa Pig on my Channel 4 show at the minute, because they do. It's very different to what your material is. Believe it or not, I have not gone down the blackface route with
Yet.
Yes.
Yeah. But they sell, Heinz do a Peppa Pig for kids pasta shapes in tomato sauce, and they advertise it as one of your 5 a day. And somebody got in touch with us to say that they think this is misleading because it's not health. It's sort of essentially presenting itself as a healthy meal, and it's not a healthy meal. But actually, technically, it is one of your 5 a day because there's 82 grams of tomato in every tin.
Oh, wow.
Despite it being like surrounded with salt and sugar and carbohydrates. So it is, they can legally say it's one of your 5 a day. So I've been sort of trying to put pressure on Heinz and Peppa Pig to be a bit more honest, I suppose, with how they label their. But I'm not sure I'll be able to crowbar in the blackface stuff into that.
Do you think they would ever do a Heinz Beans Peppa Pig special with pork sausages? Because that would just be, I mean, that's dark, right?
I find it really interesting how, as such a creative person, he sees these kind of contradictions and he kind of brings them out. And he might not seem like someone who's necessarily an outwardly critical, analytical person. No offense, Joe. You're a very smart guy, clearly from our conversation. But you can tell that he really enjoys deconstructing things. And it's honestly a pleasure to watch and to have had this conversation. And if you guys want to hear me deconstruct my other conversations, watch this one with James A. Custer and watch this one with Jimmy Carr. And if you like my stand-up, subscribe. I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.